Imagine human history as a 24-hour clock. That's it. Everything we've ever done compressed into one day. Agriculture, the thing that let us stop wandering and start planting, that doesn't show up until 11:56 p.m. The first cities, writing, the pyramids, all of that appears at 11:57. Jesus is born at 11:59:48. The Industrial Revolution happens in the last second. And everything you know, smartphones, the internet, space travel, all of it exists in a fraction of the final second. So what's everything before 11:56? What fills up the other 23 hours and 56 minutes of our story? That's not prehistory. That's not the prequel. That's the actual story. And we've forgotten almost all of it. Here's the thing nobody tells you in school. Modern humans, people anatomically identical to you and me, have existed for at least 300,000 years, probably longer. For the vast majority of that time, somewhere around 290,000 years, we lived without farms, without cities, without kings or priests or written laws. We lived in small groups, moving with the seasons, reading the landscape like a language, surviving ice ages and droughts and predators that could tear us apart. And we weren't just surviving, we were living, falling in love, raising children, creating art, developing complex belief systems, building relationships and communities that lasted generations. We were fully human, with brains just as large and complex as ours, experiencing joy and grief and wonder under the same stars we see today. But when we talk about history, we usually mean the history of civilization. We mean Mesopotamia and Egypt, Rome and Greece, dynasties and empires and wars. We act like everything before farming was just a waiting period, like our ancestors were sitting around for 100,000 years hoping someone would invent bread. That's not what happened. Those 100,000 years, those were full of human experience. Tens of thousands of generations lived entire lives. They solved problems we can't imagine. They developed technologies that kept them alive in environments that would kill most of us in days. They created songs and stories that explained the world. They laughed. They mourned. They wondered about the same questions we still ask. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens when we die? The problem is they didn't write any of it down. There are no history books from 50,000 years ago. No diaries, no letters, no tax records. Everything we know about them comes from fragments, stone tools, cave paintings, bones, genetic code, archaeological sites where you can see the scatter pattern of their meals from 40,000 years ago and try to imagine what they talked about while they ate. It's like trying to understand your entire family history from 3 photographs and a handful of your great-great-grandfather's tools. Possible, sort of. Complete? Not even close. If you're watching this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these videos. And hey, maybe drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing them. Tokyo at sunrise, Miami at midnight. It's wild that we're all here together across time zones, thinking about deep time. Because that's what we're doing tonight. We're travelling back through deep time, past the pyramids, past the first farmers, past the last ice age, all the way back to when humans were becoming truly human. Not physically, we'd been anatomically modern for a while, but cognitively. That moment somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, when something clicked in our brains and we became capable of things no species had ever done before. We're going to walk with our ancestors through landscapes that don't exist anymore. We're going to see how they hunted woolly mammoths in frozen tundras and gathered shellfish on coastlines now hundreds of feet underwater. We're going to explore the caves where they painted masterpieces by firelight 40,000 years ago. We're going to try to understand their spiritual lives, their technologies, their social worlds, the way they saw reality itself. And here's what makes this journey so strange and beautiful. Those people, your ancestors 2,000 generations back, they had the same capacity for thought you do, the same emotions, If you could somehow grab a baby from 50,000 years ago and raise them in the modern world, they'd be completely normal. They could learn calculus, play violin, become a software engineer. The only difference between them and us is time and accumulated knowledge. They didn't know less because they were dumber. They knew less because they were earlier. And in some ways they knew vastly more than we do. About survival, about reading nature, about living in balance with a world that could kill you if you made one wrong decision. So let's go back. Back before civilization, before history began in the way we usually think about it. Back to the hidden 100,000 years when humans were fully human, but living in a world we can barely imagine. Back to where our real story begins. Something changed inside the human mind between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. Not in our bodies. Those had been evolving for millions of years. Not in our brain size that had already reached modern proportions. No, this was something different. Something invisible. Something that would turn one species of clever apes into the most dominant force on the planet. Scientists call it the cognitive revolution. But that name makes it sound like a single event, a moment when someone's brain suddenly clicked into gear and everything changed. Reality was messier, stranger, and far more interesting. Picture your ancestors around 90,000 years ago. Anatomically, they looked almost exactly like you. Same skull shape, same body proportions, same brain size. If you dressed one in modern clothes and put them on a subway, you probably wouldn't notice. But if you tried to have a conversation with them, you'd immediately realize something was fundamentally different. The question that haunts archaeologists is simple and terrifying. What was going on inside those anatomically modern skulls before the revolution? They had the hardware, the biological equipment for complex thought. But did they have the software? Were they conscious in the same way we are? Could they imagine futures that didn't exist? Create meanings that had no connection to immediate survival? We don't know. We can't know. Consciousness doesn't fossilize. But we have clues, and those clues suggest that sometime in that window, something unprecedented happened inside the human mind. The earliest hints appear around 100,000 years ago in a cave called Blombos on the southern coast of South Africa. Archaeologists found chunks of ochre, a red mineral that humans have been using for hundreds of thousands of years, probably for practical purposes like hide tanning or sun protection. But these pieces were different. Someone had carved geometric patterns into them. Crisscrossing lines, carefully executed, forming abstract designs that served no practical function whatsoever. Think about what that means. Someone looked at a chunk of red rock and decided it wasn't enough for it to just be a rock. They needed it to mean something, to represent something, to be beautiful or significant or marked in some way that mattered only inside human minds. That's symbolic thinking, the ability to create and manipulate meanings that exist purely in the mental realm. And it's the foundation of everything that makes humans unique. Language, art, mathematics, religion, law, money, nations. All of it depends on our ability to create shared fictions that everyone agrees are real. But one cave doesn't make a revolution. Blombos could have been a fluke, a single genius experimenting with ideas that went nowhere. What makes the cognitive revolution revolutionary is that this kind of behavior starts showing up everywhere, across Africa and eventually beyond. Shell beads from sites in Morocco and Algeria dated to 82,000 years ago. Not just shells, but shells that were carefully selected, pierced, and worn as ornaments. Someone cared about how they looked. Someone wanted to display symbols of identity or status or group membership. Sophisticated bone tools that go beyond mere function to show craftsmanship, design, aesthetic choice, evidence of long-distance trade networks, materials moving hundreds of miles from their source, implying not just exchange but social relationships, trust, reciprocity, obligations that existed across space and time, and everywhere, ochre, more ochre than any practical purpose could justify. Our ancestors were obsessed with it, mining it, processing it, using it in ways we still don't fully understand. Probably for body paint, possibly for rituals, definitely for something that mattered deeply to them in ways that went beyond survival. So what happened? What flipped the switch inside human minds? One theory suggests it was language. Not the simple communication that earlier humans probably had, warning calls and basic coordination, but complex grammatical language capable of expressing abstract concepts, hypothetical situations, past events, and future possibilities. Language changes everything. With language, you don't just survive the world, you explain it. You create stories about why things happen, where you came from, what happens after death. You can teach complex skills without demonstration, transmit knowledge across generations without personal contact. You can lie, speculate, imagine alternatives to reality. Most importantly, you can cooperate in ways no other species can. You can create shared myths about ancestors, gods, or tribal identities that unite thousands of strangers into functioning societies. You can convince people to follow rules, make sacrifices, and work toward collective goals that none of them individually benefit from. But language doesn't appear in the fossil record. Voices don't preserve. So we're left inferring its development from the effects it would have produced. Another theory points to genetics. Maybe there was a mutation, some small change in brain wiring that opened up new cognitive abilities. There's some tantalizing evidence for this. A gene called FOXP2, crucial for language ability, shows signs of recent selection in modern humans. Changes in brain development genes might have altered how neural networks formed, creating new capacities for abstract reasoning. But genetic changes happen slowly, gradually, across populations. They don't flip switches. And the archaeological evidence suggests the cognitive revolution happened relatively quickly, within a few tens of thousands of years. That's fast for evolution. So maybe it wasn't a single cause, maybe it was a cascade. A small genetic change creates slightly better language ability. That allows slightly more complex social organization. That creates selection pressure for even better communication skills. That enables more sophisticated culture. That changes the selective environment again. Back and forth, genes and culture co-evolving, each driving the other forward in an accelerating feedback loop. And somewhere in that process, humans crossed a threshold. We became capable of imagination. Imagination is the real superpower. It's what lets you think about things that aren't real yet, might never be real, exist only as possibilities in your mind. A lion can't imagine hunting strategies it's never tried. A chimpanzee can't conceive of tools it's never seen, but humans can. We can close our eyes and run simulations of alternative realities, test ideas in mental space before committing to them in the physical world. With imagination comes storytelling, and storytelling might be the most powerful technology humans ever invented, more important than fire or stone tools or agriculture. Stories let you transmit complex information efficiently. Instead of explaining every detail of how to track prey through savanna grass, you tell a story about the great hunter who succeeded or failed. The emotional content makes it memorable. The narrative structure makes it comprehensible. The social context of telling reinforces group bonds and shared knowledge. Stories also let you create social technologies. Laws are stories about right and wrong. Religions are stories about cosmic meaning. National identities are stories about shared history and destiny. Money is a story we tell about value. None of these things exist in physical reality. They're pure fiction. But they govern our lives as surely as gravity. And our ancestors, those anatomically modern humans living between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago were figuring all of this out, probably not consciously, not understanding what they were creating. But generation by generation, their mental toolkit was expanding. Their ability to think symbolically and communicate abstractly was improving. Their capacity for cooperation through shared fictions was growing. They were becoming human, not in body, that had already happened, but in mind, in consciousness, in the peculiar ability to live simultaneously in the real world and in imaginary worlds of meaning and symbol and story. And they weren't alone. Neanderthals were doing something similar in Europe. Evidence suggests they created art, buried their dead with ritual, possibly even had language. Denisovans, about whom we know less, were probably cognitively sophisticated too. The capacity for symbolic thought might have been emerging across multiple human species, all descendants of that bottleneck population, all carrying the genetic potential for imagination. But only one species would take it to its ultimate conclusion. Only Homo sapiens would become so thoroughly dependent on shared fictions that we'd eventually reshape the entire planet according to ideas that existed nowhere except inside our collective imagination. That story, though, was still beginning, for now your cognitively modern ancestors were still just one of several human species, living in small groups across Africa, testing out their new mental abilities, learning to think in ways that would have seemed like magic to any other animal on Earth. The question wasn't whether they could imagine new worlds. The question was what they'd do with that power. Then came the moment that would define our species forever. Around 60,000 years ago, a small group of humans stood on the shores of northeastern Africa, looking across the narrow strait toward the Arabian Peninsula. They weren't the first to try this journey. Earlier groups had left Africa, spreading into the Middle East and beyond, but most of those populations had died out or been absorbed. This time would be different. These weren't random wanderers. These were people carrying all the genetic and cultural innovations refined over hundreds of thousands of years. They had sophisticated language, complex social structures, advanced tool-making techniques, and most importantly, the kind of adaptability that only comes from ancestors who survived the impossible. When they crossed that narrow water barrier, maybe just 15 miles at its narrowest point, there began the greatest journey in human history. Nobody knows exactly why they left. Maybe population pressure in Africa had grown too intense. Maybe a particularly good season made the Arabian side look promising. Maybe they were just curious, driven by that uniquely human urge to see what's on the other side of the horizon. Whatever the reason, they went, and they kept going. The genetic evidence tells us this wasn't one massive migration. It was more like a slow leak that never stopped. Small groups splitting off, moving into new territories, establishing themselves, then sending out their own splinter groups generation after generation. Each move wasn't huge, maybe just 20 or 30 miles, the distance a group could walk in a few days. But those small moves added up. Within a few thousand years, humans had spread from Africa to Australia. Think about that. In less than 5,000 years, small groups of people walking with everything they owned on their backs had colonized a quarter of the planet. The routes they took are still debated. The traditional theory suggested they followed the coastlines, hugging the shores of the Arabian Peninsula, then moving along the Indian coast towards Southeast Asia. This makes sense. Coastal environments are resource-rich, shellfish, fish, seabirds, all relatively easy to harvest with simple technology. Follow the coast and you always know where water is. You can't get lost. The ocean is your map. Recent archaeological evidence supports this coastal route. Sites along the southern Arabian coast show human occupation dating back 55,000 years or more. Shell middens, the ancient garbage dumps of seafood meals, appear along migration paths from Africa to Australia. Stone tools found at these sites show clear African ancestry, the technological fingerprints of people who learned their craft on another continent. But the coastal route wasn't the only path. Other groups moved inland, following river systems and game trails across the Arabian interior. During certain periods, when the climate was wetter, what's now brutal desert would have been grassland dotted with lakes and rivers. Archaeological sites in the Arabian interior show human presence during these green periods, evidence of people exploiting temporary environmental windows to push into territories that would later become uninhabitable. Both routes presented challenges that would have killed less adaptable species. The coast meant learning entirely new food sources. These Africans had never seen a mangrove forest, never harvested oysters, never built boats capable of crossing even small stretches of open water. They had to figure it out as they went, teaching their children skills they'd invented themselves just years before. The inland route was even more brutal. Water sources could be hundreds of miles apart. The plants and animals were unfamiliar, potentially dangerous. One wrong turn, one miscalculation about where the next water source lay, and entire groups could die of thirst. The fact that any group succeeded tells us something profound about their planning abilities and geographical knowledge, and they weren't just surviving, they were thriving enough to keep expanding. Genetic diversity patterns show that these migrating populations weren't desperate refugees fleeing disaster. They were healthy, reproducing populations capable of splitting off new groups every few generations. Each split sent pioneers into unknown territory, while the parent group stayed behind, maintaining their established territory and resources. By 50,000 years ago, humans had reached Southeast Asia. We know this because of sites like Tampaling Cave in Laos, where human remains dating to at least 46,000 years ago show clear African ancestry. These people had travelled thousands of miles from their ancestral homeland, crossing multiple climate zones, learning to exploit dozens of new food sources, and still maintaining enough of their original culture that we can recognise them as descendants of African populations. But the most remarkable journey was yet to come. Somewhere in Southeast Asia, a group of humans looked out across the ocean toward a land they might have glimpsed on clear days: Australia. Getting there would require a level of seafaring sophistication that seems almost impossible for people with Stone Age technology. Even when sea levels were at their lowest during the Ice Ages, the distance from Indonesia to Australia was never less than 50 miles of open ocean. There's no way to walk it, no islands to hop across. You have to build boats capable of carrying people, supplies, and enough water to survive days at sea. You have to navigate out of sight of land. You have to be absolutely certain you'll reach the other side, because there's no turning back once you're committed. Yet they did it. Archaeological evidence now shows humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The Majid Bebe rock shelter in northern Australia contains artifacts dating back 65,000 years, including sophisticated stone tools, ground ochre for art, and evidence of systematic hunting of large marsupials. This means humans crossed to Australia almost immediately after leaving Africa. Within just 5,000 years, they had mastered maritime technology sophisticated enough for major ocean voyages. Think about what this required. They needed to understand boat building, probably using bamboo or wooden frames covered with bark or animal hides. They needed navigation skills, the ability to read stars, currents, and weather patterns. They needed planning ability sophisticated enough to provision a voyage that might take weeks. And they needed courage, the willingness to sail toward a horizon where they couldn't be certain anything existed. The people who made that first crossing must have been remarkable, but they weren't superhuman. They were regular people using the same basic cognitive toolkit all humans share. The fact that they succeeded tells us something important about human potential. Give people a challenge, and they'll develop the skills needed to overcome it. The technology doesn't exist yet. They'll invent it. The knowledge isn't available. They'll figure it out through trial and error. That's what it means to be human. Once in Australia, these pioneers faced yet another adaptation challenge. Australia's megafauna, giant kangaroos, massive wombats, predatory birds large enough to kill humans, were unlike anything in Africa or Asia. The plants were different. The seasons followed unfamiliar patterns. The entire ecology was alien. Within a few thousand years, they'd not only adapted but spread across the entire continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from coastal regions to the harsh interior deserts. Meanwhile, back in Asia, other groups were pushing north and west. By 45,000 years ago, humans had reached Europe, entering a landscape already occupied by Neanderthals who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. This meeting would prove consequential, but that's another part of the story. The remarkable thing about this entire expansion is how consistent the pattern was. Small groups moving into new territory, adapting to local conditions, growing until they reached carrying capacity, then splitting to send pioneers even further. It's the same pattern that carried humans from the Red Sea to the Pacific in just a few thousand years. The same pattern that would eventually bring humans to every habitable environment on Earth, except remote islands that required more sophisticated navigation than Stone Age peoples possessed. Genetic studies of modern populations let us trace these ancient journeys with remarkable precision. Indigenous Australians carry genetic markers that diverge from African populations around 60,000 years ago, exactly matching the archaeological timeline. Native Americans carry markers showing their ancestors split from East Asian populations around 25,000 years ago, then crossed into the Americas during the last ice age. Pacific Islanders show the genetic signatures of multiple migration waves, each pushing further into the unknown ocean. Every one of these migrations required the same fundamental human capacities: the ability to learn and adapt quickly, the capacity to cooperate in groups large enough to survive but small enough to move efficiently, the creativity to develop new technologies when old ones proved inadequate, and the courage to keep moving into unknown territories when staying in familiar places would have been safer. The people who made these journeys weren't thinking about conquering continents or making history. They were just living their lives, moving to new hunting grounds when old ones became crowded, following animal migrations, exploring that interesting valley they could see in the distance. But those small decisions, repeated across thousands of generations, resulted in the most comprehensive biological invasion in the planet's history. Within 50,000 years of leaving Africa, humans had reached nearly every habitable environment on Earth. We had adapted to tropical rainforests and Arctic tundra, to mountain highlands and coastal lowlands, to deserts and wetlands and everything in between. No other large mammal has ever achieved anything remotely comparable, and we did it with stone tools, fire, and the most powerful adaptation evolution ever created, the human mind capable of solving any problem, overcoming any obstacle, adapting to any environment. The journey was just beginning. So let's talk about what they actually did all day. Your ancestors, the ones living 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 years ago. Because here's the thing that most people get completely wrong. When we imagine prehistoric humans, we picture desperate savages, dirty, hungry, constantly struggling just to survive another day, living in caves, eating raw meat, dying young. That's the image popular culture has burned into our brains. But the archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. These people weren't primitives barely clinging to existence. They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers with rich, complex daily lives, and in some ways they might have lived better than the agricultural societies that would come later. Let's start with the caves, because that's the first myth we need to destroy. Yeah, they sometimes used caves, but mostly as temporary shelters, seasonal camps, or ritual spaces. Most of the time, your ancestors lived in the open. They built sophisticated structures from wood, bone, and hides. Archaeological sites across Europe show evidence of large communal dwellings that could house 20 or 30 people, not crude lean-tos either. These were engineered structures with interior hearths, designated sleeping areas, even separate zones for different activities. One site in what's now the Czech Republic shows a dwelling built from mammoth bones and hides. The bones were arranged in careful patterns to create a domed structure, with heavy tusks used as anchor points. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of multiple hearths, positioned to maximize heat distribution. There were storage pits dug into the floor, work areas where stone tools were manufactured, even what appears to be a designated trash disposal area, some distance from the main structure. These people understood sanitation, thermal dynamics, and spatial organization. They were architects. In Africa, evidence is harder to find because wood and plant materials decompose quickly in tropical climates. But what we do find suggests even more sophistication. Sites show rings of stones that probably held down the edges of temporary structures made from branches and leaves. But these aren't random camping spots. They're carefully chosen locations near water sources, with good sight lines for spotting both game animals and potential threats. They're positioned to catch breezes in hot weather and shelter from wind in cold seasons. Your ancestors were reading the landscape like we read books, choosing the optimal spot for every camp based on dozens of environmental variables, and they moved constantly. Not because they were desperate nomads fleeing starvation, but because they were following a sophisticated seasonal round. Modern studies of remaining hunter-gatherer societies show this pattern clearly, and archaeological evidence suggests it goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Spring in one valley where certain plants become available, summer near a river where fish spawn, fall in the uplands where nut trees drop their harvest, winter back to a base camp where stored food and shelter materials wait. This wasn't random wandering. This was an annual cycle as precisely timed as any farmer's planting schedule, except it required even more detailed environmental knowledge. Think about what that means. Your ancestors knew hundreds, maybe thousands of plant species. Which ones were edible, which were poisonous, which could be made edible through processing. They knew when each plant flowered, fruited, went to seed. They knew which roots could be dug in spring, which berries ripened in summer, which nuts fell in autumn. They could read animal tracks and scat to identify species, age, sex, and health status. They understood migration patterns of herds across entire regions. They knew where to find water in every season, how to predict weather changes from wind patterns and cloud formations, which caves held flint for tools and which had the right clay for pottery. This was a different kind of intelligence than what we value today, but it was just as sophisticated, probably more so in many ways. A modern human dropped into their world would die quickly. They dropped into ours would probably figure it out eventually. The learning curve might be steep, but the basic cognitive toolkit was already there. And here's what really challenges our assumptions. They didn't work very hard. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers consistently find the same pattern. About 15 to 20 hours per week spent on what we'd call subsistence activities. Hunting, gathering, food processing, tool maintenance. That's it. Compare that to agricultural societies where farmers worked from dawn to dusk every day during planting and harvest seasons. Compare it to modern industrial societies where 40-hour work weeks are considered standard and many people work far more. Your ancestors had time. Lots of it. What did they do with all those hours? They socialized. They played games. They told stories. They made art. They explored their environment not out of necessity but curiosity. They experimented with new techniques for making tools, processing food, decorating their bodies. They had leisure, genuine leisure, in a way that wouldn't exist again for most of humanity until very recently. The camp during a typical day might look like this. Dawn breaks and the camp slowly wakes. No alarm clocks, no rigid schedules. People rise when they're ready. A fire is rekindled from embers that were banked the night before, a technique that saves the effort of starting fresh fires every day. Someone begins preparing a morning meal, probably using leftovers from the previous evening, plus whatever fresh plants can be quickly gathered nearby. Children play under the loose supervision of whoever's around. There's no formal childcare arrangement because everyone's watching everyone. The whole camp is a shared space. Young children play games that teach skills they'll need later. Tracking games where they follow marks in the dirt. Throwing games that build coordination. They're learning constantly, but it doesn't look like education. It looks like fun. Meanwhile, a few adults head out to check snares set the day before. Others might go to a nearby stand of nut trees to see if anything new has fallen overnight. This isn't intensive work. It's a morning walk that happens to provide food. They're back by mid-morning with whatever they found, probably chatting and laughing the whole way. The middle of the day is when serious work happens, but even that is social. A group decides to go hunting. Not because the camp is starving, but because meat sounds good and the weather's right and someone saw game tracks yesterday. They prepare their weapons, discuss strategy, head out as a coordinated team. Or maybe today's a plant gathering day instead. A different group walks to a location several miles away where certain tubers are ready for harvest. They bring digging sticks and collecting bags, working together to extract the tough roots, sharing the labour and the conversation. Back at camp, someone's making new tools, not frantically, not under pressure, but with the careful attention of a craftsperson who has time to do things right. Others might be processing hides, making cordage from plant fibres, repairing dwelling structures. These are all necessary tasks, but they're being done in a relaxed communal atmosphere. People work together, share techniques, help each other with difficult parts of the process. Then there's the evidence that really changes how we think about these people. The care for the disabled and elderly. We find skeletons from this period showing individuals who survived for years or even decades with serious injuries or disabilities. A Neanderthal skeleton from Iraq shows a man who had lost an arm years before he died. He couldn't have hunted effectively, couldn't have contributed to heavy labour, but he lived to old age. Someone was caring for him, feeding him, protecting him, not out of genetic obligation necessarily, out of something we might call compassion. Another skeleton from Spain shows evidence of a severe spinal deformity that would have left the individual nearly immobile from childhood. Yet they lived to adolescence. For years, someone carried them when the group moved. Someone fed them. Someone made sure they didn't get left behind. There was no economic utility to this. It was pure care, and elderly individuals show up regularly in the archaeological record, people who lived well past their reproductive years. In purely Darwinian terms, these individuals were consuming resources without contributing to genetic fitness. But every hunter-gatherer society we know values elders as repositories of knowledge. They're walking encyclopedias of ecological information, survival techniques, social traditions. They're the ones who remember what to do when rare events happen, the flood that comes once every 30 years, the animal migration that shifts unpredictably, the plant that's usually poisonous but becomes edible when processed just right. Your ancestors understood something that modern society sometimes forgets. A community is stronger when it includes everyone. The disabled person might not hunt, but they could make tools, tend fires, watch children. The elderly might not gather food, but they could teach, advise, settle disputes. Everyone had value. Everyone belonged. Evenings were when the magic happened. The group gathered around fires as darkness fell. This is when stories were told. Not just entertainment, though they certainly were entertaining. These stories were how knowledge passed between generations, how to find water in the dry season, what plants cure which ailments, where the herds migrate in different years, all coded into narratives that were memorable, repeatable, transmittable across time. This is also when music happened. Bone flutes from 40,000 years ago show sophisticated understanding of musical scales, but the tradition is certainly older. Your ancestors were singing, drumming, making rhythmic sounds with whatever materials were available. Why? Because humans make music. It's what we do when we have time and we're together and we're feeling good about the world. And they were laughing. We know this not from direct evidence, obviously, but from universal human nature. Every culture that exists today laughs, jokes, teases, plays. There's no reason to think your ancestors 100,000 years ago were any different. The camp at night wasn't just about survival, it was about joy. As the fire burned down, people drifted towards sleep. No alarm clocks waiting, no schedules to keep. Just the rhythm of days following nights, seasons following seasons, years flowing into years. They measured time by natural cycles, the moon waxing and waning, the stars rotating through their annual patterns, the migrations of animals and the flowering of plants. It was a good life. Hard sometimes, certainly. Dangerous, yes, but also rich, complex, deeply satisfying in ways that later agricultural societies would lose. These people had autonomy, leisure, strong social bonds, and intimate knowledge of their environment. They had art, music, story, and play. They had everything that makes us human, everything that matters. And out of this life of relative abundance and creativity, everything else would eventually flow. The innovations that would lead to civilization, the social structures that would become kingdoms, the stories that would become religions, the art that would cover cave walls and eventually canvas. But that was still far in the future. For now, your ancestors were simply living, and living well. Imagine walking into a cave in southern France. It's 1994 and you're part of a team exploring a narrow passageway that's been sealed for thousands of years. You squeeze through a tight opening and your flashlight beam hits the wall, and there, staring back at you, are lions. Dozens of them. Perfectly rendered, muscular, alive. Not crude stick figures, not primitive scratches. These are masterpieces. The horses gallop across the limestone, the rhinos charge, the bears lumber with weight you can almost feel, and they're 36,000 years old. This is Chauvet Cave, and it changed everything we thought we knew about early human art. For decades, archaeologists had a comfortable narrative. Human artistic ability developed slowly, gradually, starting with crude scratches and evolving over thousands of years into sophisticated imagery. The famous bulls of Lascaux, painted around 17,000 years ago, were supposed to represent the peak of prehistoric art, the culmination of millennia of slow development. Then Chauvet was discovered, and that narrative collapsed. Because the paintings in Chauvet aren't just older than Lascaux, they're better, more sophisticated, more dynamic, more technically accomplished in almost every way. The artist who painted those caves 36,000 years ago understood perspective, shading, movement, and anatomical accuracy at levels that wouldn't be matched again for tens of thousands of years. But here's what really keeps archaeologists awake at night. Chauvet isn't the beginning of this artistic tradition. It can't be. Nobody wakes up one morning and suddenly paints a masterpiece without practice, without training, without a long tradition of learning and experimentation. Which means human artistic ability must go back even further, possibly much further. We just haven't found the earlier examples yet. Maybe they were painted on rock shelters that eroded away. Maybe they were drawn on wood or hide that decomposed. Maybe they're still waiting in caves we haven't discovered. But somewhere, somehow, humans made the leap from basic communication to genuine art. And we still don't fully understand why. The traditional explanation is that something changed in the human brain around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. A genetic mutation, maybe. A rewiring of neural pathways. Something that gave us symbolic thinking, abstract reasoning, the ability to imagine things that don't exist, and then bring them into existence through art. But the more evidence we gather, the less satisfying this explanation becomes. Because artistic impulses show up across the world, in populations that had been separated for thousands of years. In Indonesia, cave paintings date back at least 45,000 years. In Australia, Aboriginal rock art might be even older, though dating it precisely is difficult. Hand stencils appear in caves from Europe to Argentina to Asia, all showing remarkably similar techniques, created by people who had never met, who had no way of sharing ideas across oceans and continents. This suggests art isn't something that happened once, that was invented by one population and spread. It's something fundamental to being human, something that emerged naturally, inevitably, wherever humans had the time, resources, and safety to express themselves. But what were they expressing? Why bother spending hours, days, maybe weeks painting animals on cave walls when you could be hunting, gathering, making tools, doing something practical that directly helped survival? Walk into any of these painted caves and you immediately sense that something important was happening here. These weren't casual doodles. Many of the images are placed in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the cave systems. Places you'd need torches, ropes, maybe scaffolding to reach. Places where no natural light ever penetrated. The artist had to carry fire into absolute darkness, mixing pigments from minerals, charcoal, and animal fat, applying them with brushes, fingers, maybe blowing them through hollow bones. This took effort. Deliberate, sustained, difficult effort. They were doing this on purpose. They were trying to accomplish something specific. But what? The oldest explanation is hunting magic. Paint the animal, control the animal. Ensure success in the hunt by symbolically capturing your prey on the cave wall. It's a satisfying theory, except most of the animals painted in these caves weren't actually hunted very often. Analysis of bones from nearby living sites shows the painters were mostly eating reindeer, but they painted mostly horses, bison, aurochs, and dangerous predators like cave lions. Animals they admired, maybe. Animals that impressed them, but not necessarily animals they ate. Then there's the Lion Man, found in a cave in Germany, carved from mammoth ivory around 40,000 years ago. It's about a foot tall, and it's utterly impossible. A human body with a lion's head. Something that never existed, never could exist, except in someone's imagination. Whoever carved this spent hundreds of hours working ivory with stone tools, creating something that served no practical purpose whatsoever. No one was going to eat it, wear it, use it to hunt or build or survive. It was pure imagination made real. It was art for art's sake. Or maybe it was religion. The Lion Man might represent a deity, a spirit, a shaman transformed, something beyond the everyday world. It proves that by 40,000 years ago, humans weren't just surviving anymore. They were thinking about meaning, about identity, about the relationship between human and animal, real and imagined, visible and invisible. The hand stencils are even more direct. Found in caves across every inhabited continent, the technique is always the same. Place your hand on the wall, blow pigment around it, leave a negative image, a permanent record. I was here. I existed. Remember me. Some of these hands are small, probably children. Some show fingers missing, possibly from frostbite or accidents. One cave in Spain shows hands spanning at least 25,000 years, generation after generation returning to the same spot to add their mark. It's one of the most human things imaginable. The desire to leave something behind, to say to the future, I lived, I mattered, don't forget me. And then there are the Venus figurines, small carved figures, mostly female, found across Europe and Asia, dating from roughly 35,000 to 10,000 years ago. Some show exaggerated breasts and hips, leading to theories about fertility symbols or mother goddess worship. Others are more realistic. Some show elaborate hairstyles or clothing. A few show faces, though most don't. What were they? Religious objects, portable art, dolls, self-portraits? Nobody knows. But they were important enough that people carried them across vast distances, important enough to craft carefully from stone, ivory or clay, important enough to preserve and protect over thousands of years. The debates about the Venus figurines reveal how little we actually know about prehistoric minds. Modern interpretations tend to project our own assumptions backward. Male archaeologists once dismissed them as primitive pornography. Feminist scholars interpreted them as evidence of ancient matriarchies. Others see fertility magic, body positivity, ancestor worship, teaching tools. The truth is, we're looking at objects created by people whose worldview is so different from ours that we can barely guess at their meanings. But one thing seems clear. These weren't just practical objects. They were meaningful. They mattered to their creators in ways that transcended simple survival. Music might be even older than visual art. Bone flutes discovered in Germany date back more than 40,000 years, carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory with precisely spaced finger holes. These aren't random objects. They're carefully crafted instruments, designed to produce specific notes, specific sounds. Someone sat down and figured out the mathematics of sound production, experimented with hole placement, tested different materials, and they did this not because music helped them hunt or gather or survive, but because humans needed music, needed rhythm, melody, shared sonic experience. Cave paintings and carvings might have been accompanied by singing, chanting, drumming. Archaeologists have identified parts of caves with unusual acoustics, places where sound resonates in strange, powerful ways. Were these the first concert halls? Places where communities gathered not just to see art, but to experience it, to participate in rituals that combined visual, auditory, and probably kinesthetic elements into overwhelming sensory experiences. Think about what this means. 40,000 years ago, your ancestors weren't just struggling to survive. They were creating. They were painting, sculpting, carving, playing music, dancing, probably telling elaborate stories we'll never hear. They were building cultures as rich and complex as any that would come later. They just didn't have writing to preserve them, cities to monumentalize them, or agriculture to support them. But the impulse was there. The need to create, to express, to leave something beautiful behind. It was already fully human, fully developed, fully sophisticated. We didn't become creative. We've always been creative. Art isn't something civilization gave us. It's something we brought with us into civilization, something older and deeper than agriculture, older than cities, older than everything except language itself. And here's something fascinating that researchers are starting to discover. Much of this art might have been created by women, by children, by people traditionally invisible in archaeological narratives. Hand stencils show that at least half, maybe more, belong to women and adolescents. The detailed, patient work of painting and carving fits patterns of female labour in many hunter-gatherer societies. The Venus figurines, if they are self-portraits, suggest women creating images of themselves, defining their own identities rather than being defined by male observers. We've spent centuries assuming prehistoric art was made by men. Now the evidence suggests otherwise. The first artists might have been mothers, painting while their children played nearby, grandmothers, passing techniques down through generations, teenagers, experimenting with style and meaning. The art explosion that happened around 40,000 years ago wasn't a sudden mutation or miraculous invention. It was the flowering of something that had been building for tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands. Something fundamental to what it means to be human. The need to transform the world, to make it mean something, to leave marks that outlast our brief lives. Your ancestors did this. Deep in dark caves, by flickering torchlight, they created beauty for its own sake. They sang songs that have been silent for 40,000 years. They told stories that will never be recovered. But the impulse that drove them lives on. Every time you draw, sing, dance, or create anything at all, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back into the deepest darkness of prehistory. You're doing what humans have always done, making meaning out of existence, turning survival into something worth surviving for, and this was only the beginning. Now we need to talk about something that doesn't fossilize, something that leaves only the faintest traces in the archaeological record, but something that might be the most important adaptation humans ever developed. Belief. Not belief in the modern sense, organized religion with priests and temples and written scriptures. That came much later. We're talking about something more fundamental, more ancient. The moment when humans started believing that death wasn't the end, that there was something beyond the visible world, that the spirits of ancestors still mattered to the living. The evidence is scattered and fragmentary, but it's there if you know where to look. The oldest deliberate burial we've found dates back over 100,000 years. A cave in Israel, Kafsa Cave, where early modern humans laid their dead to rest with intention and care. Not just dumping bodies in refuse piles or leaving them where they fell, but digging graves, positioning bodies carefully, sometimes placing objects alongside them. Why would you do that unless you believed the dead person still existed somehow, still needed things, still mattered? Here's where it gets really interesting. The Neanderthals were doing it too, maybe even earlier. Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq has given us some of the most haunting evidence of Neanderthal burial practices. Between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago, Neanderthals were using this cave as a shelter, a home, probably for generation after generation. And when members of their group died, they buried them there, carefully, deliberately, in positions that suggest thought and intention. One burial in particular has captured imaginations for decades. Shanidar 4, as archaeologists call it. When researchers excavated the grave in the 1960s, they found something unexpected. Pollen, lots of it, concentrated around and under the skeleton in patterns that suggested flowers had been placed in the grave. Not just any flowers, medicinal plants, yarrow, cornflowers, hollyhocks, plants that had healing properties, that meant something to the people who gathered them. The image is almost unbearably poignant. Neanderthals gathering wildflowers to place with their dead, standing at the edge of a grave, maybe saying words we'll never know, certainly feeling something we'd recognize as grief. Now there's debate about this. Some researchers think the pollen got there through natural processes, burrowing animals or wind. But the concentration patterns are hard to explain away that easily. And even if Shanidar 4 is controversial, there are other Neanderthal burials that clearly show intentional treatment of the dead. Graves with stone tools placed beside the body, burials where the deceased was positioned in a fetal position, as if sleeping. One remarkable site in France where a Neanderthal child was buried with what appears to be a carefully shaped flint tool placed near their hand. These weren't just disposal of corpses, these were rituals, acts of meaning-making in the face of death. What does that tell us about Neanderthal minds, about their inner worlds? It tells us they had crossed a threshold that most animals never approach. They had developed an awareness of death as a permanent state, not just the absence of movement, but something final and significant. And having grasped that finality, they had developed an immediate response to mark it, ritualize it, maybe even deny it by creating an afterlife in their imaginations. This is huge. This is the beginning of religion, of spirituality, of every philosophical and theological system humans would ever create. But burial is just the most visible evidence. There are other clues, harder to interpret but equally suggestive. Cave art, for instance. When you stand in front of a 30,000-year-old painting on a cave wall, you're not just looking at a pretty picture. You're looking at a window into someone's mind, and that mind was doing something very strange. Many of the most famous cave paintings are located in extremely difficult-to-reach places, deep underground through narrow passages, in chambers where you'd need to crawl or squeeze to enter. Why go to all that trouble? Why not paint near the entrance where everyone could see? Because these weren't just decorations, they were sacred images, placed in sacred spaces. Some researchers think these deep caves served as ritual sites where shamans or spiritual practitioners would go to enter trance states and communicate with the spirit world. The theory goes like this. In darkness, isolated from the community, possibly fasting or using plant-based psychoactives, a shaman would enter an altered state of consciousness. In that state, they would experience visions, geometric patterns that would eventually coalesce into animals, human figures, spirit beings, and then they would paint what they saw. The art itself shows evidence of this process. Many cave paintings include strange geometric symbols, dots, grids, zigzag patterns that researchers think represent entoptic phenomena, the visual patterns your brain generates during altered states. These patterns show up in cave art from Europe to Africa to Asia, suggesting similar practices across vast distances and time periods. The animal figures often seem to emerge from the rock itself, using natural formations as part of the image. A bulge in the cave wall becomes a bison's shoulder. A crack becomes a wounded animal's blood. This suggests the artist believed the spirits of the animals were already in the stone, just waiting to be revealed. And many of the paintings are located near areas with unusual acoustics, chambers that echo strangely, passages where sounds reverberate and distort. Try singing in some of these caves, and your voice transforms into something otherworldly. Did ancient shamans use these acoustic properties to enhance their rituals, creating soundscapes that made the spirit world feel present and real? But it wasn't just caves. The prehistoric landscape was dotted with sacred places, stone circles, some dating back over 10,000 years. Arrangements of rocks that clearly took enormous effort to create but have no obvious practical purpose. They're not defensive structures, they're not housing, they're ritual spaces, places where communities gathered to perform ceremonies we can only imagine. Ochre shows up everywhere in the archaeological record, starting at least 100,000 years ago. This red mineral pigment, sometimes ground into powder, sometimes shaped into crayons, appears in burial sites, living areas, and what seem to be ritual contexts. People were painting their bodies with it, sprinkling it on the dead, possibly using it in ceremonies. Why ochre? Why red specifically? Maybe because it's the color of blood, of life. Using it in death rituals might have been a way of symbolically returning life to the deceased, or marking them as still part of the living community. Or maybe the color itself was believed to have power, to protect against spirits or invoke ancestral presence? We're guessing, but the ubiquity of ochre across time and space tells us it meant something profound to ancient humans. Dreams probably played a crucial role in early spiritual experiences. Every night your ancestors would enter states of consciousness where the impossible became routine. Dead relatives appeared and spoke. Animals transformed into humans. You could fly, breathe underwater, travel to distant places instantly. How would you interpret these experiences without modern neurological knowledge? Obviously, you'd think you were visiting another realm, a spirit world that existed parallel to the physical one, accessible during sleep or trance states. The dead lived there. Animal spirits dwelled there, and with the right knowledge, shamans could travel there deliberately, bringing back information and power. This dream-based spirituality probably led to ancestor veneration, the belief that dead family members remained active presences in the community. They could help or harm the living depending on how they were treated. So you made offerings, told stories about them, maintained their memories across generations. This created a kind of cultural immortality. Your physical body died, but your memory, your spirit, your influence could persist indefinitely as long as your descendants remembered you. And this might have been one of religion's most important functions: social cohesion. Think about the challenges facing a prehistoric community. You've got 20, 30, maybe 50 people trying to cooperate despite competing interests, personal conflicts, resource scarcity. What keeps everyone working together instead of fragmenting or fighting? Shared belief. If everyone believes their ancestors are watching, judging, expecting certain behaviors, that's powerful social pressure. If everyone participates in the same rituals, visits the same sacred places, tells the same stories about the spirit world, that creates bonds that transcend individual relationships. Religion doesn't just connect humans to the supernatural, it connects humans to each other. The archaeological evidence suggests this binding function was crucial. Sites with evidence of ritual activity often show less interpersonal violence than sites without it. Communities that invested in ceremony and sacred spaces seem to have been more stable, lasting longer in the archaeological record. Belief made cooperation possible on scales that would otherwise have been impossible. And maybe that's the real miracle here. Not that ancient humans developed elaborate mythologies or complex rituals, but that they figured out how to use imagination to change reality. They invented invisible forces, spirits, and ancestors, and sacred places, and those inventions changed how people behaved, how communities organized themselves, how culture transmitted across generations. The spirit world wasn't real in a physical sense, but it was real in its effects. Real enough to bury your dead with flowers. Real enough to crawl deep underground to paint visions on cave walls. Real enough to gather stones into circles and perform ceremonies under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Your ancestors were creating meaning in a universe that offered none. They were answering the hardest questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? With stories that might not have been literally true, but were true enough to live by. And those stories, those beliefs, those rituals, they were adaptations just as important as opposable thumbs or large brains, maybe more important. Because in the end, what kept human communities together through ice ages and droughts and countless disasters wasn't just intelligence or technology. It was the shared conviction that something larger than individual survival mattered, that the dead still watched, that the spirit world touched this one. That meaning existed beyond mere existence. Whether they were right or wrong doesn't matter as much as this. It worked. Imagine watching one of your ancestors work a piece of stone. They're not just banging rocks together. They're sitting very still, knees drawn up, the raw material in one hand, a carefully chosen hammerstone in the other. Every strike has to land at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right force. Too hard, and the stone shatters. Too soft, and nothing happens. Too steep, and the flake plunges into the core. Too shallow, and it just glances off. There's no written manual, no YouTube tutorial, just memory, muscle, and years of watching older relatives do the same thing. Archaeologists who try to recreate these tools say it can take years of practice to get good. Your ancestors were doing this as teenagers. Some probably specialized in it, just as some people today become carpenters or chefs. In some African sites from around 300,000 years ago, stone points are so regular you could stack a dozen and see almost no difference in size or shape. That's not random skill. That's training. That's tradition, and it wasn't the same everywhere. Different regions developed their own styles, just like later pottery or architecture. One valley might favor long, slender spear points. Another might prefer wide, leaf-shaped blades. You can almost hear an elder grumbling, "No, we don't do it like the river people do. Watch closely." This is what a Stone Age mind really means. Not simple, not primitive. A brain tuned to a different kind of problem. How to turn a lump of rock into a tool that could mean the difference between eating and starving, between driving off a predator and becoming food. The stone itself became a kind of language. The shape of a point told you what it was for: cutting meat, scraping hides, drilling holes, shaping wood. The patterns of flaking told you where it came from, who made it, maybe even which group they belonged to. A single tool carried a story of geology, travel, teaching, and time. And stone was only the beginning. Fire changed everything. You were born into a world where fire is a switch on the wall, a lighter in your pocket, a stove in your kitchen. For most of human history, fire was a miracle you had to earn every single day. By the time our ancestors were fully modern in mind and body, fire wasn't just an occasional lightning gift. It was a technology, something you could plan around, something you could, at least sometimes, make. They learned where to find the right wood, how long to dry it, how to shield the coals from wind and rain. They figured out that some stones, like flint and pyrite, could be struck together to shower sparks into dry grass. They learned that glowing embers could be carried in bark cones, or hollow bones from camp to camp wrapped up like precious cargo. Fire turned tough roots and sinewy meat into soft, digestible food. It unlocked more calories from every bite. It killed parasites and softened toxins. Over tens of thousands of years, this steady stream of easier energy may have helped support larger brains, smaller guts, longer childhoods. But fire was more than chemistry. It was choreography. Night and deep time was dangerous. Big cats, hyenas, packs of wolves moved through the darkness. Eyes glowed at the edge of vision. Sound carried strangely. A bright, crackling hearth was a bubble of safety where dangerous creatures hesitated to come too close. Inside that circle of light, something new bloomed. Unstructured time. Hunting was done. Gathering was finished. The children were fed. There was nowhere to go in the dark. So people talked, repaired tools, told stories, shared memories of distant valleys and strange animals, passed on knowledge that would keep children alive long after their parents were gone. Under that moving orange light, the Stone Age mind was not just surviving. It was remembering, imagining, comparing, dreaming, and the colder the world became, the more that fire mattered. As the ice ages deepened, your ancestors faced winters that could kill in hours, wind that cut through bare skin, snow that blanketed the ground, hiding food. In those conditions, a fire alone wasn't enough. The body needed armor. At some point, probably multiple times in multiple places, humans made a different kind of leap. They stopped just draping skins over their shoulders and started turning them into clothes. This sounds obvious, but it's incredibly sophisticated. To make a fitted garment you must skin an animal without tearing the hide, scrape the inner side clean with specialized tools, dry or smoke it so it doesn't rot, soften it with fat, brains or plant oils, punch holes with an awl, thread sinew or plant fiber through those holes in a repeating pattern that holds the whole thing together. Needles with eyes show up in Neanderthal and early modern human sites tens of thousands of years ago. That single object implies an entire invisible technology. Cutting patterns, fitting garments, tailoring for children, pregnant women, hunters, elders. Clothing wasn't just warmth. It was mobility. It turned lethal winter landscapes into survivable ones. When you picture a caveman, don't imagine a half-naked figure shivering in rags. Imagine an experienced person layered in carefully made hooded parkas, leggings, mittens, boots, stuffed with insulating grasses. Think Arctic hunter, not cartoon barbarian. To do all this, our ancestors had to become masters of combination. A stone flake in your bare hand is useful but limited. It can cut but not with much leverage. It gives you no reach. If it slips, it cuts you. At some point, humans began doing something no other animal does, building tools out of multiple parts that had to be gathered, processed, and assembled in a particular sequence. Take a simple hefted spear point. To make one you need a shaped stone tip, a straight shaft, likely from a carefully chosen species of wood, plant fibers or animal sinew, prepared and twisted into cord, an adhesive, resin from trees, mixed with powdered charcoal or ochre or beeswax to get the right consistency. Each of those steps is its own little technology. You need to know which trees give the best sap and how to heat it without burning it. You need to recognize the right kind of stone on site, often from miles away. You have to understand that heat changes materials. Resin melts and flows, then cools and hardens. Sinew shrinks when it dries, pulling everything tight. This is abstract thinking. Cause and effect stretched over hours or days. If I heat this now, it will hold that later. It's also memory. You have to remember recipes. 3 parts resin, 1 part ash, a dusting of ochre, not in numbers, but in textures and colours. Compound tools like this appear in both Neanderthal and early modern human sites. Whoever was making them had to hold a mental blueprint in their head. They were, in a very real sense, engineers, and sometimes their projects were bigger than any one valley. On certain coasts, archaeologists find something that doesn't belong. Obsidian from far inland, shells from distant shores, red ochre from quarries hundreds of miles away. These are not random pebbles. They're carefully selected materials, often worked and reworked, passed hand to hand across vast distances. To move them, people needed more than feet. There is growing evidence that humans, and probably Denisovans before them, were crossing stretches of open water tens of thousands of years ago. Islands in Southeast Asia were never fully connected to the mainland, even when sea levels were lower. Yet stone tools appear there, and then on islands beyond them, in sequences that suggest deliberate travel. We don't have their boats. Wood and fibre rarely survive that long, but we can infer them from what had to be true. To cross a channel you must float. To float safely with gear and children, you need something better than a single log. Perhaps rafts of lashed timber or bundles of reeds. Perhaps hollowed trunks, shaped with fire and stone tools. Either way, you need to see water not as a barrier but as a road. You need to plan your route, remember landmarks, understand tides and currents well enough not to be swept endlessly into open ocean. Again, this is a different kind of mind than ours, not a lesser one. On land, hunting was changing too. For a long time, humans and Neanderthals relied on thrusting spears. You got close to the animal. You braced. You drove the point in with the full force of your body. Dangerous, exhausting, but effective. Then somebody, somewhere, thought to extend the arm itself. An atlatl, or spear thrower, is a simple device, a lever with a hook at one end. You notch a light spear into that hook, whip your arm forward, and the atlatl multiplies your throwing power. A well-thrown spear with an atlatl can travel much farther and hit much harder than any hand-thrown dart. To invent this, you have to notice something subtle. Longer levers throw things faster. You have to experiment with angles, lengths, weights, until the motion feels right. The earliest atlatl-like tools likely appeared tens of thousands of years ago. They made hunting safer by allowing humans to stand farther from a charging animal, and more efficient by increasing success rates. Later still, somewhere in Africa or Eurasia, another revolution, the bow and arrow. Now, instead of throwing the entire projectile, you store energy in a bent piece of wood and release it into a tiny shaft. The bow is a machine made of tension, elasticity, and timing. It requires perfectly straight arrows, standardized points, fletching, string that can withstand constant strain. It takes years of practice to shoot well, but once mastered, it transforms the human-animal relationship. You can hunt smaller, faster game. You can hit from concealment. You can defend your group at a distance. The bow turned human hands into something even more lethal and more flexible than claws or fangs. Behind all these inventions there was a web of exchange. Some valleys had rich flint deposits, others had none. Some coasts had shells ideal for beads, others didn't. Some cliffs bled deep red ochre that could be ground into paint or used in rituals. That colour shows up in caves and burials hundreds of miles away from its source. This means people were travelling, or trading, with distant groups. A piece of obsidian in your camp might have passed through 10 different hands, crossing rivers and mountains, moving steadily along a chain of kinship ties and reciprocal obligations. Trade was more than economics. It was information flow. When a hunter from the east arrived with a new style of spear point, others saw it, copied it, improved on it. Ideas began to move faster than genes, hopping from group to group, region to region. This is why, across huge stretches of land, we sometimes see similar tool traditions emerging almost simultaneously, not because everyone had the same random idea at once, but because the Stone Age mind lived in a network. From the outside, looking at the timeline, it can seem painfully slow. A particular tool type appears and then sticks around for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. For modern eyes, used to new phones every few years, that can feel like stagnation. But remember the scale of their lives. If you are born into a world where a particular spear point, a particular way of making fire, a particular style of clothing keeps everyone you love alive year after year, there's no urgent reason to change it. Innovation is risky. New designs can fail catastrophically. A bad experiment with glue or shaft wood can mean a wounded hunter, a lost kill, a hungry winter. There was no mass market, no advertising, no pressure to upgrade. There was only the quiet, constant test of reality. Does this work, or does it not? Change, when it came, was often triggered by outside forces, a shift in climate, a new animal moving into the region, a rival group appearing with slightly better tools. Under those stresses, small improvements mattered. A sharper edge, a stronger binding, a warmer boot. These tweaks accumulated slowly, almost invisibly, over hundreds of generations. If you could compress those tens of thousands of years into a few minutes, it would look very different. You'd see blades shrink and lengthen, points narrow and thicken, new materials appear, old techniques fade, fireplaces shift in shape and arrangement, camps change layout, clothing needles appear, then multiply. Distant shells begin to show up inland, ochre use intensifies. Atlatls and bows spread from valley to valley. It wouldn't look slow at all. It would look like what it was, minds just like yours, thinking their way through a dangerous, beautiful, unpredictable world. Stone, fire, clothing, glue, boats, levers, bows, trade. None of these were separate from the people who used them. They shaped the rhythms of the day, the stories told at night, the boundaries of what felt possible. They were the physical shadows of an invisible thing, a brain that could imagine a future different from the present, and then reach out into the world and build it, flake by flake, stitch by stitch, spark by spark. Picture waking up in that world, not as a lone survivor in a wasteland, but as a member of a tiny, tightly knit band, maybe 20, 30, at most 50 people. That's your entire social universe. Everyone you know, everyone you love, everyone you argue with, everyone you rely on, sleeps within a few dozen paces of you. There is no anonymity, no strangers, no crowds to disappear into. Every decision you make, every mistake, every act of generosity or selfishness is noticed, remembered, woven into the ongoing story your group tells about itself. Anthropologists call these band societies, the smallest, most intimate kind of human community. No villages, no cities, no written laws, just a handful of extended families moving together across the landscape, following the seasons, the animals, the ripening plants, and in that small scale, everything changes. In a band of 30 people, you can't really have a dictator. You can't have a king with a palace, or a general with an army. If someone starts ordering everyone around, there's a simple solution. People walk away. They pack up their few belongings, their children, their tools, and join another group, or form a new camp a few valleys over. Power in this world is fragile. So most researchers think these early human bands were relatively egalitarian, not in the sense that everyone was identical, but in the sense that no one could accumulate too much power without consequences. Leadership was probably fluid, shifting with context. One person might guide a hunt because they knew the migration routes. Another might lead when it came to finding water, reading clouds, understanding subtle signs in the landscape. An elder might carry the authority of memory, knowing where the group had survived a drought 40 years ago, where there was a hidden spring in the basalt hills. Decisions were likely made in long, slow conversations, people sitting around a fire after dark, voices low, children half asleep on their parents' laps. We see echoes of this in recent foraging societies, extended discussions, teasing, joking, nudging, until some kind of consensus emerges. No votes, no raised hands, just a gradual alignment of opinions until it feels wrong to push further. If someone tried to dominate, the group had soft weapons, laughter, mockery, refusal to cooperate. In many traditional foraging cultures, arrogant hunters are publicly teased, their kills downplayed, their boasting cut down with humour. It's a social technology for keeping everyone in check, for preventing the rise of tyrants when your survival depends on cooperation, not obedience. But even though each band was small and relatively equal on the inside, they were never truly isolated. We know this because of the stones. Archaeologists keep finding tools made from rock that doesn't belong where it's found. Obsidian blades showing up hundreds of miles from the nearest obsidian source, shell beads far inland, pigments that had to be carried across mountain ranges and deserts. This isn't random wandering, it's evidence of networks. Imagine your band has a favourite campsite near a river. Once a year in the dry season, you're not the only ones who show up. 2, 3, maybe 4 other bands arrive. Old friends, distant cousins, people you haven't seen since last year. The riverside camp transforms from a quiet circle of shelters to a bustling seasonal meeting ground. Information flows. Who found a new flint source? Where the herds have shifted? Which valleys are dry? which are dangerous, which are strangely quiet. Objects flow too. A spear point from far to the north gets passed to you in exchange for a bundle of red ochre from your hills. A necklace of shells from the coast finds its way, trade by trade, into the hands of someone who has never seen the sea. But the most important exchanges aren't tools or pigments, they're people. Genetic evidence shows that early humans were not breeding randomly within isolated clans. There were patterns, structured exchanges of marriage partners between groups. This suggests something like rules, even if they were never written down. Maybe you couldn't marry someone from your own band, or maybe you had to find a partner from your mother's relatives or your father's allies. We don't know the exact systems, but we see the signature. Distant bands consistently linked by kinship ties. Think about what that means emotionally. When your band goes to that seasonal meeting place, you're not just trading stone and meat. You're seeing your sister, who married into another band 5 years ago. You're meeting a nephew for the first time. You're negotiating marriages for teenagers who were children at the last gathering. The human world is larger than your daily campsite, but it's still bound by the language of family. And then there are the grandparents. In almost every other primate species, when you're too old to reproduce, your evolutionary story is basically over. But humans are different. We have long post-reproductive lifespans, grandmothers and grandfathers who live on for decades after they can no longer have children themselves. Why? One leading idea is the grandmother hypothesis. It suggests that older women, no longer tied down by their own pregnancies and breastfeeding, played a crucial role in feeding and protecting grandchildren. A grandmother who could dig up hard-to-find tubers or crack open tough nuts with years of skill allowed her daughter to have more children, more closely spaced. Her genes benefited not by direct reproduction but by keeping her descendants alive. Now scale that up to a whole band. Elders are walking libraries. They remember places no one alive has seen in their prime. They remember which plants are safe, which are poisonous, which only become edible after soaking or parching or roasting a certain way. They remember stories of the last time the rains failed, the last time strangers came over the ridge, the last time the river ran red with flood water. In a world with no writing, no archives, no internet, knowledge lives in people's minds, and those who've been alive the longest carry the densest, most compressed data. Children might spend their days partly with parents, partly in wild, chaotic play with other children, but also partly at the knees of grandparents, listening to stories, being corrected, absorbing rules, myths, survival tricks without even realizing they're learning. That 3-generation unit, grandparent, parent, child, may have been one of the key engines of human cultural evolution. Everything in this world is built on cooperation. Hunting large animals isn't something one person does alone with a heroic spear charge. It's dangerous, messy, highly coordinated. Some people drive the herd, others wait in ambush. Some distract, some kill, some finish the wounded. If one person panics or rushes too soon, the whole plan collapses and people can die. Childcare is shared too. In many modern foraging societies, alloparenting, care by people who aren't the biological parents, is the norm. Aunts, uncles, older siblings, grandparents, even unrelated camp members all pitch in. Your survival doesn't depend on just your mother. It depends on a whole network of adults who will pick you up when you cry, carry you when you're tired, hand you food, pull thorns from your feet, teach you which berries stain your fingers and which stain your insides. Food, when it's found, is rarely just hoarded. Sharing meat is almost universal among hunter-gatherers. That doesn't come from pure angelic generosity. It's a long-term survival strategy. You give today when you're lucky, so that someone else will give tomorrow when luck turns. Over tens of thousands of years, natural selection favoured minds that could handle this kind of social accounting. Who shared last time? Who cheats? Who pulls their weight? Who is generous even when they are tired? Our brains are wired to track reciprocity in excruciating detail because in these small bands, reputation is everything. Lose your reputation for fairness, and you might lose your access to future help. But cooperation was never perfect. Underneath the warmth of the campfire and the gentle rituals of sharing lies something darker. Skeletons from deep time sometimes tell stories that are not peaceful. Healed fractures in skulls, broken noses, forearms with old defensive breaks where someone raised an arm to ward off a blow, arrow points or spear tips lodged in bone. In some rare sites, clusters of bodies with signs of violent death, blunt force trauma to the head, embedded projectiles, no signs of careful burial. These scenes look disturbingly like massacres. Conflict was not invented by civilization. It's older than writing, older than agriculture, older than cities. But in the world of bands, it probably looked different from modern war. There were no massed armies, no generals deploying thousands. Instead, imagine sudden ambushes at dawn, a raid on a sleeping camp to steal women, children, food, tools, a quick, brutal clash at a waterhole when two bands arrive desperate and exhausted, and there simply isn't enough for everyone. A long simmering feud between groups that escalates when a hunting accident kills someone's brother and is interpreted as an attack. Yet the same fragile ecology that could spark conflict also made persistent war unattractive. Losing a few hunters in a tiny band isn't just tragic, it's catastrophic. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone is someone's cousin, someone's in-law. A single act of revenge can ripple through the whole social network. So probably there were also peacemaking rituals, gift exchanges, arranged marriages designed to smooth over grudges. Every individual in this world has to walk a tightrope between two opposing forces. On one side is autonomy, your desire to do what you want, go where you want, hunt how you want, fall in love with whom you want. On the other side is cohesion, your need for the group, for protection, for help raising children, for access to shared resources, for the comfort of familiar faces in the firelight. Lean too far toward autonomy, and you risk exile. Lean too far toward conformity, and you risk suffocation, anger, resentment. The balance is constantly renegotiated, moment to moment, conversation to conversation. You might push back against a suggested camp move, arguing to stay near a grove of fruit trees. You might refuse a proposed marriage. You might secretly meet someone from another band at the seasonal gathering. Human social life has always had a hidden layer of quiet resistance and personal dreams, even in the most communal settings. Holding all of this together, cooperation, conflict, memory, identity, is language. Not just a few grunts and calls, but rich, structured speech capable of expressing who owes what to whom, who is related to whom, which plant to gather when the moon is in a particular phase, how to nap a stone or weave a net, what happened long before you were born. Around the fire at night, storytelling isn't entertainment layered on top of survival. It is survival. A story about the ancestor who ignored a certain cloud formation and got caught in a deadly storm is a way of encoding meteorology as narrative. A myth about spirits that live in a particular ravine might really be a deeply remembered warning about rockfalls, snakes, or flash floods. Children drift asleep listening to these stories. As they do, their brains are quietly building mental maps of the world, who to trust, where to go, what to fear, what to hope for. Adults listen too, correcting details, adding new episodes, arguing over interpretations. The stories themselves evolve, generation after generation, adapting to new conditions just like genes. Through language, a band of 30 people can carry the experience of thousands of years. Lessons learned in a drought 100 generations ago can still shape how someone makes a decision tomorrow morning. And because bands are linked in those long-distance networks, stories travel too. They flow along with obsidian blades and shell beads. A tale that began at one end of a continent might, centuries later, echo faintly in the ritual of a group thousands of miles away. When we look back on that world from today, from our cities and nations and digital networks, it's easy to imagine those small bands as simple, but their social worlds were anything but simple. They were dense, layered, fragile and resilient all at once, built out of family ties and trade partnerships, rivalries and friendships, whispered gossip and public jokes, oaths sworn by the fire and quiet acts of kindness in the dark. This was the social laboratory where humanity was forged, where cooperation became our greatest strength, where conflict sharpened our wits and our caution, where grandparents became libraries, where language became a lifeline, and where the intricate dance between self and group began to take the shape we still live with today. And all of it, every argument, every alliance, every lullaby murmured in the dark, was happening under the same stars we see now, in a world that was almost nothing like ours, and yet built the foundations of everything that would come after. Imagine looking at the last 2 million years not as a straight line, but as a heartbeat monitor. Up, down, warm periods and cold periods pulsing across deep time. That's the Pleistocene, the age of ice. For most of this era, the world your ancestors knew wasn't stable. It swung, sometimes slowly over tens of thousands of years, sometimes brutally fast in just a few human lifetimes. Temperatures could drop by several degrees in a couple of centuries. Rain belts shifted, forests turned to grassland to desert, and then back again. If you could time-lapse those millennia, you'd watch massive ice sheets breathing in and out, glaciers crawling down from the poles, swallowing mountains, then retreating again, sea levels falling hundreds of feet as water locked up as ice, then rising to flood ancient coastlines, drowning valleys where people had once walked. Your ancestors didn't see graphs and climate models. They saw the symptoms: rivers shrinking, animals disappearing from familiar valleys, snow lines creeping down the hills where they gathered berries last year. They saw storms in seasons that used to be calm, and they had to react. Every time the climate lurched, human populations lurched with it. Some groups were cut off as rising seas flooded coastal plains. Others found their hunting grounds buried under advancing ice. A few were suddenly gifted with new wetlands or grasslands as rainfall patterns shifted in their favour. For us, these are just lines on a chart. For them, each shift was life or death. Geneticists can still see the fingerprints of those crises in our DNA. Over and over again, the genetic record shows the same pattern: expansions and crashes. Times when human numbers grew, spread, diversified, and then suddenly shrank. The bottleneck you heard about before wasn't the only close call, it was just the most extreme. Later in the Pleistocene there were other squeezes. Some seemed to line up with enormous volcanic eruptions, like the Toba super eruption around 74,000 years ago. A blast so powerful it may have thrown enough ash into the atmosphere to dim the sun, trigger years of cold, and disrupt ecosystems across whole continents. Did it nearly wipe us out again? Some researchers think so. Others argue the effect was more regional, that humans in Africa and Asia rode it out better than we once believed. The evidence isn't settled, but the pattern that matters is clear. Our numbers dropped. Diversity in our genes narrowed. Once more, we passed through a tightening gate. These bottlenecks weren't clean, simple events. They were messy, uneven crises. Some regions hit hard, others spared. Some lineages snuffed out, others flourishing in hidden corners. But the cumulative effect was the same. Again and again, humanity walked along the cliff edge. And then, late in the Pleistocene, came one of the harshest tests of all, the last glacial maximum. Picture the world around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. If you live in North America or Europe today, much of what you know would have been unrecognizable. Two colossal ice sheets sat on top of the northern hemisphere. In North America, the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets crushed forests, reshaped mountains, and pushed south in some places almost as far as modern New York and Chicago. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia and much of northern Germany and Poland. Under those ice sheets, nothing human could live. No plants, no animals, no soil. Just miles of moving, grinding ice. South of the glaciers, conditions weren't comfortable either. Winters were longer, colder, drier. Winds howled off the ice fronts, picking up dust and dropping it in thick layers of loess across Europe and Asia. Vast areas that had once supported mixed forest turned into cold, open steppe. Sea levels plunged more than 100 meters below what you know today, exposing wide continental shelves. There were land bridges where now there are seas, between Siberia and Alaska, between Britain and mainland Europe, between parts of Southeast Asia. For modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, this wasn't just a bit chilly. It was a full-body challenge. To survive, people needed more than warm coats. They needed strategies, places to hide from the worst of the cold. These places are what scientists call refugia. A refugium is like a secret room in the mansion of Earth's climate. While blizzards rage in the halls and corridors, a few sheltered rooms stay just warm enough for life to hang on. Maybe a coastal strip where ocean currents bring milder air. A deep valley protected from the wind. A river system that still flows even in dry times. During the last glacial maximum, refugia became the cradles of survival. In Europe, human groups pulled back from the advancing ice and gathered in southern strongholds. The Iberian Peninsula, parts of Italy, the Balkans, the areas around the Black Sea. In these pockets, cold but not utterly lethal, people could still find game, fuel, and fresh water. In Asia, the story was more complex. Some groups likely hugged the coasts, relying on marine resources. Fish, shellfish, seals, buffered somewhat from the worst inland cold. Others retreated into river valleys and lower plains where herds still grazed on hardy grasses. In Africa, ice sheets didn't advance, but the climate still shifted dramatically. Some regions dried out. Others became more seasonal or unstable. Populations contracted into more favorable zones, along rivers, in highlands with reliable rainfall, in pockets where forest and grassland mixed. Inside these refugia, life narrowed. Home ranges shrank. People probably moved less and knew every rock, every stand of trees, every animal trail within a few days' walk. Social networks might have thinned as distances between safe zones grew. Isolation increased. Different refugia developed their own tool styles, their own customs, their own ways of telling stories around the fire. If you could sit quietly at the edge of one of those fires, you would have seen a very different daily life than in the lush interglacial times before. Clothing wasn't optional anymore. It was armor. People wore layered hides and furs sewn with bone needles so fine that some still astonish archaeologists today. They made tailored garments, leggings, parkas, boots lined with soft fur, hoods designed to trap warm air. Shelters weren't just windbreaks of branches and leaves, they were engineered spaces. In some parts of Ice Age Europe, people built semi-permanent dwellings with mammoth bones as frameworks, covered in hides, insulated with earth and snow. Caves became long-term homes, with hearths carefully placed to draw smoke upward and leave living areas relatively clear. And at the heart of all of it, there was the hunt. The Pleistocene world, even in its coldest phases, was full of giants, mammoths and mastodons roaming the steppe, woolly rhinoceroses, in the Americas giant ground sloths the size of small trucks, armoured glyptodons like living tanks, herds of enormous bison. In Eurasia, towering aurochs, wild horses, and the cave bears that claim the darkest chambers underground. For humans, these animals were both danger and salvation. Hunting a mammoth wasn't just about meat. It was about everything. A single kill could feed a band for weeks. The hide could become clothing, shelter coverings, bags. The sinews became thread. The bones became tools, building materials, even fuel. Fat could be burned for light or stored as dense energy for lean times. But taking down something that large in sub-zero temperatures, often with wind-whipping ice crystals into your face, wasn't simple bravery. It was finely tuned knowledge and cooperation. You'd need to know the migration routes, the weak points in a herd's defensive circle, how ice and snow would support or betray your footing. Hunters might drive animals toward concealed pits or into boggy ground where their weight worked against them. Spears, sometimes tipped with carefully shaped stone or bone points, had to be thrown with precision. In some regions, people used spear throwers, atlatls, to launch projectiles farther and harder than a bare arm could manage. Every part of the hunt was learned behavior, taught across generations, refined, shared between bands. A bad decision could mean shattered bones, frostbite, or an entire group facing starvation a month later. And it wasn't just hunting. Your ancestors had to compete with other predators, packs of wolves, prides of lions, solitary saber-tooths, often stalking the same herds. Sometimes scavenging a kill from other carnivores was safer than bringing down the prey yourself. Sometimes it was a deadly gamble. When archaeologists look at Ice Age kill sites, they see the evidence of this constant tension. Cut marks on bones layered over tooth marks from wolves or big cats. Scattered remains that suggest hurried butchering, a quick retreat before other predators arrived. For a long time, those enormous Ice Age animals seemed like permanent fixtures of the landscape. But by the end of the Pleistocene, most of them were gone. Almost everywhere you look, the timeline is similar. As climates warmed after the last glacial maximum, megafauna populations began to shrink. In many regions, their final disappearances happen within a few thousand years of the arrival of modern humans, or of humans using new, more efficient hunting technologies. Did we kill them all? Some researchers argue that we did, or at least that we finished what climate started. The overkill hypothesis suggests that even small human populations, armed with cooperation, fire, and sharp tools, could take a disproportionate toll on slow-breeding giants. A few % extra mortality each year could push species already stressed by changing vegetation over the edge. Others point out that the picture isn't that clean. Some megafauna vanished in places where human presence seems late or sparse. Some survived for thousands of years alongside humans in isolated refuges, like mammoths lingering on Arctic islands long after they vanished from mainland Siberia. Ice cores and lake sediments show rapid climate swings exactly when many of these animals disappear, suggesting that ecosystems themselves were in turmoil. The truth may lie between climate change altering habitats, shortening growing seasons, changing plant communities, and humans adding an extra layer of pressure. More efficient hunting of adults. Fire used to shape landscapes, sometimes in ways that hurt large browsers and grazers. Competition for the same patches of nutrient-rich land. Whatever combination of forces caused the extinctions, the result was profound. The ecosystems that shaped human evolution for hundreds of thousands of years. The mammoth steppe, the giant sloth forests, the world of cave bears and saber-toothed cats faded away. New assemblages of animals took their place. Deer, smaller bovids, wild pigs, smaller carnivores. Humans adapted again. Because that's the other constant thread through all these ice ages and crashes. Movement. Each climate swing turned the world into a shifting maze. Grasslands advanced into former deserts, forests pushed into tundra, Coastlines moved tens of miles in or out. Rivers carved new channels or dried up and vanished. Your ancestors followed. Sometimes slowly, over generations, as herds gradually shifted their ranges and people went with them. Sometimes abruptly, when drought hit, or when a once reliable valley failed. Groups that had lived in one region for thousands of years found themselves gradually or suddenly somewhere else. These movements weren't random wanderings. They were guided by memory, rumour and cautious exploration. Scouts heading out a little farther each season, stories about distant valleys where the rain still fell, faint tracks of migrating herds leading toward unfamiliar horizons. Over thousands of years, these small steps added up to continental journeys, across exposed land bridges into new worlds, along coasts that are now drowned under modern seas, through mountain passes that would eventually become political borders and trade routes. Every time the climate changed, human cultures changed with it. New tools, new hunting strategies, new shelters, new rituals to make sense of a landscape that never stayed the same for long. By the time the ice sheets began their final retreat around 15,000 years ago, your species had become experts at living with uncertainty. You carried in your traditions a deep, instinctive understanding that the world could flip in a single lifetime, that rivers could vanish, that animals could disappear, that winter could harden and refuse to let go. That hard-won flexibility, the ability to move, to innovate, to cooperate under pressure, would become the most important inheritance of all. Because as the ice pulled back and new lands opened up, those same survival skills would be turned to something new. Instead of just enduring what nature threw at you, you would begin, slowly, tentatively, to reshape nature itself. The age of ice was ending. The age of fields and villages was drawing closer, just beyond the horizon. Drift forward in time. For tens of thousands of years after the first great expansions out of Africa, human life follows a kind of rhythm. Ice ages come and go. Glaciers advance and retreat. Forests shift into grasslands and back again. But through it all, your ancestors adapt without fundamentally changing what they are. They are foragers, hunters, gatherers, fishers. They move with the seasons, follow herds, track ripening plants. They live in small bands and loose networks, knit together by kinship, story, and trade. Their technology improves, their art flourishes, their rituals deepen, but the basic pattern of life stays recognizably the same. Then, very late in the story, almost at the end of the Ice Age, the rhythm stutters. Around 12,800 years ago, as the world is slowly warming, something strange happens. The climate jerks back toward glacial conditions. Temperatures plunge. In the northern hemisphere, ice sheets stop retreating and in some regions begin to advance again. Rain patterns shift. Ecosystems wobble. This cold snap has a name, the Younger Dryas. To your ancestors, it would not have been a line on a climate graph. It would have been a series of bad years, then worse years, then a new normal that felt nothing like the one they had expected. In the Levant, what is now Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and nearby regions, people had been enjoying a kind of golden age for foragers. The end of the last ice age had brought milder winters, wetter conditions, and flourishing stands of wild cereals, barley, wheat, rye, growing in dense patches like ready-made fields. Herds of gazelle and other game browsed nearby. Rivers and springs were reliable. You could, for the first time in human history, stay put for much of the year and still eat well. Then the Younger Dryas hit. The climate turned drier and colder. Those lush stands of wild grain shrank. Some springs failed. Animal populations shifted or declined. For people who had begun to build semi-permanent villages, this was a crisis of expectations. You can wander when you live light. It's harder when you've already started to settle in. Faced with this new unpredictability, human groups along the eastern Mediterranean seem to have tried something radically different. Instead of just moving to where the food was, they began to change the food itself. Not in one leap, not as a grand plan, as a series of small, desperate, clever experiments. Picture a group of foragers watching a shrinking patch of wild barley. They know its rhythms. They've harvested it for generations. They've seen what happens when animals trample the seeds. They've noticed that if you drop some grains near the camp, new plants sometimes sprout the next year. Now resources are tightening. You can't count on wandering to the next valley and finding abundance there. Every stand of grain matters. So someone, an old woman who's watched the plants all her life, a child with a curious streak, a hunter waiting out a storm, starts to gather not just the seeds, but the soil around them. They scatter those seeds closer to camp, where they can watch and protect them. If you do that once, nothing much changes. If you do it every year for centuries, choosing the fattest seeds, the least fragile stalks, something starts to shift. This is the beginning of cultivation. At first, it doesn't look like farming. People are still foraging, still hunting, still moving at least part of the year. But they are also nudging plant populations, pulling up weeds around favourite stands, burning patches of land to encourage certain species, saving seeds from good years to plant in bad ones. Early animal management likely begins the same way. If you're following herds of gazelle or wild sheep, you notice their patterns. Which animals are aggressive, which are calm, which mothers protect their young. Over time, people may have started selectively culling or protecting individuals, favouring more manageable animals, guiding their movements, maybe penning them temporarily in natural enclosures. It's not yet herding in the full sense. It's more like a growing intimacy between humans and certain animals, a blurry zone between predator and manager. The Younger Dryas doesn't last forever. After about 1,200 years, the world warms sharply again. Ice sheets retreat, sea levels rise, vegetation zones race northward. But by then, in some regions, your ancestors have already taken steps down a path that will be hard to reverse. They have tried, in a small way, to stabilize nature and discovered that it can be bent. Out of this period of experimentation and stress comes one of the strangest sights in all of archaeology. Göbekli Tepe, high on a hilltop in what's now southeastern Turkey, around 11,600 years ago, people began building something that should not exist, at least not according to our old stories about how civilization began. At Göbekli Tepe, there are no houses, no storage pits full of domesticated grain, no obvious signs of settled farming life. The people who came here were almost certainly still foragers, moving across the landscape behind migrating herds, gathering wild plants, fishing rivers, and yet, on this lonely ridge, they raise stone circles of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons. The stones are carved with reliefs of animals, lions, boars, foxes, vultures, snakes, scorpions. Some show abstract symbols. 2 central pillars in each circle stand like stylized human figures, with hands carved along their sides, belts and loincloths etched in stone. To build these circles, hundreds of people would have had to coordinate. Someone had to quarry the stone. Someone had to haul it. Someone had to carve the images. Someone had to plan the layout, align the pillars, oversee the work. Others had to feed the workers, organize tools, manage the site. Göbekli Tepe looks, in many ways, like a temple, a place of ritual gatherings, a ceremonial center where scattered bands converged at certain times of year to feast, to perform rites, to renew alliances. It suggests that large-scale, organized, symbolic architecture did not wait for farming and cities. It came first. In a sense, Göbekli Tepe flips the old story on its head. Instead of agriculture creating the surplus that allows monuments, It may be that the desire for shared ritual spaces, for grand gatherings and feasts, helped push people toward more intensive food production. If you want to host a festival for hundreds of guests every year, wild resources alone may not be reliable enough. You start cultivating grain not because you love farming, but because you need to feed a crowd. Around the same time, to the south and west, another culture is living through the transition between foraging and farming in a more gradual everyday way. Archaeologists call them the Natufians. From about 14,500 to 11,500 years ago, Natufian communities flourished in the Levantine corridor, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Western Syria, Jordan. They are some of the first people we know of who build permanent stone houses while still relying heavily on wild foods. Natufian villages are small clusters of semicircular houses, partly dug into the ground, with stone foundations and brush or thatch roofs. Inside we find grinding stones, mortars and pestles worn smooth by years of use, suggesting intensive processing of wild cereals and nuts. Outside we find cemeteries, with burials carefully placed, sometimes adorned with shell beads or animal parts. These people are not yet farmers. They hunt gazelle, deer, small game. They gather wild barley, wheat and oats. They collect nuts, fruits and seeds. But they also stay put for much of the year. They invest in building solid structures. They return to the same places generation after generation. Over time, some Natufian sites grow larger and more complex. Sedentism, staying in one place year-round or nearly so, is a profound shift. When your camp is temporary, possessions are a burden. You own what you can carry. A few tools, some clothing, perhaps a portable ornament or two. Social hierarchies are hard to freeze in place when everyone can walk away. When you start building houses that last decades, maybe longer, everything changes. You can store food, grain in pits, nuts in baskets, dried meat hanging from rafters. You can accumulate tools, heavy grinding stones, large vessels. You can mark specific spots as ours, a house, a hearth, a burial. Land starts to take on meaning as property, not just as habitat. Sedentism also allows for new kinds of social relationships. Grandparents can live near grandchildren. Ancestors can be buried under house floors, tying living families to specific addresses through memory and ritual. Feasts can become more elaborate when you have fixed places to host them. Alliances and rivalries can grow deeper when you see the same neighbouring bands every season. But staying put has a cost. For mobile foragers, the landscape is like a vast buffet. If a patch is overhunted or a grove of trees fails, you move elsewhere. Your body is adapted to varied diets and constant movement. In most cases, hunter-gatherers are surprisingly healthy. Tall, with strong bones, relatively little tooth decay, low rates of many chronic diseases. Once you commit to a particular valley or hill, you are locked into its fortunes. If the local harvest fails, you can't always leave. Your house, your fields, your buried ancestors are here. Your neighbours are competing for the same nearby resources. It becomes harder to avoid conflict by simple distance. As people begin to cultivate plants more systematically, another shift emerges. Diets narrow. Early farmers in many regions rely heavily on one or two staple crops. Wheat and barley in the Near East, millet and rice in parts of Asia, maize in the Americas. These foods are efficient sources of calories, especially in good years, but a life built around cereal, porridge and bread is less diverse nutritionally than a forager's seasonal diet of roots, nuts, fruits, meats, and wild greens. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show the effects. Average heights drop. Bones show signs of heavier labour. Teeth wear down from stone grit in ground grain, and cavities increase. Evidence of anemia and other nutritional stress appears more frequently. In many early agricultural villages, infant mortality increases. Inequality creeps in too. Grain can be stored, counted, controlled. Fields can be claimed, parcelled out, defended. Those who manage surplus, who run the granaries, coordinate labour, or claim ancestral rights to the best land, have new ways to exert power. Over generations, differences in status that might have been fluid in small bands begin to harden. Freedom of movement, once a simple option, becomes complicated. Leaving a village means leaving land, stores, graves, social obligations. A bad leader, an unfair system, a rising hierarchy are harder to escape when home is not just where you are, but where your ancestors lie and your food grows. All of this might make it seem as if the shift to agriculture was some kind of destiny, a one-way march towards civilization that began as soon as people got clever enough. But the evidence suggests something more nuanced, and in many ways more haunting. The turn toward farming was not inevitable. For tens of thousands of years, humans with brains just like ours did not farm, even though they knew plants intimately, used fire to shape landscapes, and understood animal behavior in astonishing detail. Even after the first experiments with cultivation, many groups chose to remain foragers or mixed forager farmers for thousands of years. In some regions, people tried early agriculture, then walked away from it when conditions changed. The decisive pushes seem to come at particular moments and places, when climate shifts make wild resources less predictable, when growing populations press against the carrying capacity of stable, rich environments, when ritual centers and social networks demand regular feasts and offerings, creating pressure to produce surplus. In other words, farming emerges as a series of local solutions to local problems, not as a universal upgrade. Each valley, each coastline, each river plain tells its own story of experiments, failures, partial adoptions, and only gradually, full commitment. From the vantage point of deep time, this moment, these few thousand years when some humans first tether themselves to fields and villages, is sharp and bittersweet. On one side of the threshold is a world where your ancestors roam through open landscapes, following migrating herds, visiting sacred hills and caves seasonally, carrying their stories in memory and song. Health is fragile, dangers are real, but so is a certain kind of autonomy. If a place becomes hostile, you can leave. If a leader abuses power, you can walk away in the night. On the other side is a world beginning to fill with permanent marks of human presence. Stone houses, storage pits, boundary walls, fields that must be weeded and watered, sacred enclosures like Göbekli Tepe rising against the sky. Life here offers new forms of security, stored food, thicker networks of kin, places that endure beyond a single lifetime. It also brings new vulnerabilities, dependence on harvests, rigid hierarchies, conflict over land, diseases that flourish in crowded settlements. Standing at this threshold, your ancestors could not have known what was coming. Cities, kings, writing, empires, taxes, armies, law codes, libraries, philosophies, factories, skyscrapers. They only knew that the old ways were becoming harder, the climate less predictable, the gatherings more ambitious, the ties to particular places stronger. They were planting seeds, literal and metaphorical, that would grow into everything we now call civilization. And once those seeds took root, the world of deep time, the world in which humans had lived for over 95% of their existence, began to fade. Not all at once, not everywhere. Foragers, pastoralists, and mixed societies would continue and still exist today. But the balance was shifting. Fields were spreading, villages were growing, monuments of stone were rising in landscapes that had once known only wind and weather. The long, wandering childhood of our species was ending. The age of settlements, surplus, and states was about to begin. So now, as the story slows down and the night gets deeper, come back to yourself for a moment, to your breathing, to the weight of your body where you're resting. This body you live in isn't a modern invention. It's a survival machine tuned across those hidden 100,000 years. Your hands are Stone Age hands, built to shape tools, carry firewood, cradle infants, scrape hides, braid fibers, and gesture while you speak. Your eyes are hunter-gatherer eyes. They notice movement at the edge of vision. They look for paths, faces, firelight. Your nervous system still expects a world of small groups and open horizons, not traffic lights and notification pings. Even your emotions are old. The warmth you feel with close friends. That's the echo of bandmates huddled round a fire sharing meat and stories after a dangerous hunt. The anxiety you feel when you're excluded or ignored. That's the alarm bell of an ancient brain that knows exile could once mean death. The strange comfort of repetitive tasks, stirring a pot, knitting, tidying a room, that's the memory of countless hours gathering seeds, grinding grain, chipping stone, doing the small careful things that kept people alive. Civilization sits on top of all this like a thin layer of new paint. Cities, money, screens, schedules. These are the experiments. Agriculture, writing, kingdoms and corporations, algorithmic feeds and electric light. All of it compressed into the last tiny sliver of our timeline. For well over 90% of our species' existence, none of that was here. No skyscrapers, no empires, no 9 to 5. Just small groups of humans moving through big landscapes, adjusting to the seasons, watching the sky. That's the humbling part. We tend to treat our modern world as if it's the default, the destination evolution was aiming for. But from the perspective of deep time, it's the weird exception, the strange new thing we're still figuring out how to live with. The real baseline of human life is a campfire under unfamiliar stars, the hush of night insects, the crackle of embers, the sound of someone's voice telling a story in the dark. And that might be the deepest connection between you and those long-gone ancestors. The stories. For hundreds of thousands of years before writing, before cities, nighttime was the great theatre of the human mind. Imagine those countless prehistoric nights. People lying on their backs, staring up at a sky without light pollution, every star sharp and bright. Listening to the wind move through grass, to distant animal calls, to the quiet breathing of sleeping children. What did they dream about? What tales did they spin to explain the moon's changing face, or the patterns of the constellations? What kinds of lullabies did they sing? What jokes did they tell? What whispered fears did they share when someone woke suddenly from a nightmare? We'll never know the exact words, but the need behind them, the urge to weave meaning out of darkness, that's still with you. Every time you drift off imagining other lives, other worlds, you're doing something very old. So as you lie there, listening, maybe in a city apartment or a small-town bedroom or a dorm room far from home, remember, you're not separate from that deep past. You're the latest chapter in an unbroken chain of survivors. Every ancestor, from the bottlenecked bands scraping by on a hostile planet to the Ice Age hunters tracking mammoths across frozen plains, managed to live long enough and lucky enough for the story to reach you. If you've enjoyed this journey through deep time and it's helped you fall asleep or just feel a little more connected to the human story, you can gently show it. Tap like if you'd like more explorations like this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet trip into the past. And when you have a moment, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. A bedside in London, a night shift break room in Manila, a farmhouse in Canada, a student hostel in Kenya. Seeing those places appear feels a little like watching ancient trade routes light up on a map. Tiny points of fire scattered across the world, all connected by shared stories. If you'd like to go one step further and support this channel, There's also an optional membership here on YouTube. It helps us keep making these long, carefully researched, sleep-friendly histories. But it's completely up to you. Just listening, just being here, already makes you part of this little community. For now, you don't have to do anything. Let your thoughts slow down. Let the noise of the day drain away. Somewhere behind you stand 1,000,000 generations, carrying fire, carrying tools, carrying songs. Tonight you carry their quiet. As you drift off to sleep, remember, you are not alone in time. You're the living edge of a very old story. And that story is still being written with every breath you take.